After 33 months of staggering losses, you'd think Putin might have packed it up by now. But no, he's still at it, pouring Russia's resources and soldiers into Ukraine like it's some personal obsession. He's burned through nearly half of Russia's budget on his bogged-down operation and become a global laughingstock in the process. But for what? What's the real prize here for Putin? Because it's definitely not adding up. Well, it turns out that the answer lies in the extensive intertwined history of both Russia and Ukraine, but also in global geopolitics of the past few decades. We'll also need to look at Putin's idea of what Russia is now and what it could be in the future. If you ask Putin, he'll probably tell you that Ukraine and Russia are two countries that started out as one, and then became separated over time. To clarify just how that happened, let's go back to the 10th century. An East Slavic tribe during the 900s had managed to occupy huge swathes of territory, from the Black Sea in the south to the Baltic Sea in the north. The Slavs placed the capital of their newly formed state in the city of Kiev, which is today's Kyiv, and the people subsequently came to be known as Kievan Rus. The state rapidly converted to Eastern Orthodoxy and restructured itself into a principality. The state of the Kievan Rus lasted for about 300 years, before fragmenting into multiple states consisting of East Slavs and people from other cultures. However, most of the territory occupied by the Kievan Rus was later merged into the Grand Duchy of Moscow. Nevertheless, the territory of Ukraine would become a separate state during the following centuries. Later during the 19th century, the territory of modern Ukraine was conquered by the Russian Austro-Hungarian empires, which directly led to Ukraine becoming a part of the Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution in the early 20th century. But despite being separate states between the 12th and 19th centuries, the Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian nations, even the names themselves, are all considered to have their roots in the Kievan Rus. This is an idea that's permeated through each of these respective cultures, and one that Putin is trying to twist to his own advantage. Arguably, his biggest justification for claiming that the regions of Ukraine that Russia has annexed should belong with, or more precisely to, Russia, stems from the fact that both ethnic Ukrainians and ethnic Russians were frequently relocated within the Ukrainian state and throughout the entire Soviet Union. This migration has led to modern Ukraine containing significantly more ethnic Russians than it did before World War II. According to census data, the number of ethnic Russians climbed from only 9% of the total population in 1939 to close to 18% in 2001. The region with the highest percentage of Russian population in the early 21st century was Crimea, the first part of Ukraine annexed by Russia in 2014. After the fall of the Soviet Union and throughout the 90s, Ukraine became increasingly oriented toward the West. The first steps towards Ukraine joining the EU came all the way back in 1998, with various agreements being made that would allow Ukraine to gradually adopt all measures required by the EU before it could become a member. By 2000, Ukraine was considered an EU candidate that could become a full member in as little as 10 years. At that time, Ukraine ostensibly wanting to deepen its ties to the EU wasn't such a problem for Putin. Instead, it was another of Ukraine's geopolitical moves that Putin was much more concerned about, and still is, its desire to join NATO. Unlike the EU, which is primarily an economic entity, NATO is a military alliance whose weapons have been primarily aimed at Russia. Ukraine joining NATO would bring this hostile military alliance right onto another of Russia's borders, the biggest one, and one perilously close to Moscow. The proposal for Ukraine to join the alliance was announced in 2008 at a summit in Bucharest. The aptly named Bucharest Declaration also put forth the idea that Georgia would also be a likely NATO candidate. Georgia was in a similar position to Ukraine at the time. As a former Soviet country, the Georgian government tried to remove itself from its Soviet roots and orient to the West. However, the country also had a sizable Russian population, especially in its northwestern regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Putin used that fact to prevent Georgia from going anywhere near NATO. According to NATO rules, a country can't join the alliance if it's engaged in active military conflict or a territorial dispute. A war broke out in Georgia in 2008, which led to Russian-backed separatists breaking away in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Russia invaded Georgia, justifying the act as helping their Russian compatriots in the country. The two regions have now declared independence, although only Russia and a handful of other countries recognize them. Georgia isn't one of them. Although the shooting stopped many years ago, the two breakaway republics host large contingents of Russian forces, and so long as Russian troops remain on what Georgia insists is its territory, Georgia will never be able to join NATO. Ukraine wasn't that much of a problem for Putin at that time. While in general the country had been leaning ever more toward the West, Viktor Yanukovych was elected president in 2010. Yanukovych was pro-Russian and pursued policies that deepened ties between the two countries. While Ukraine's long-term trajectory remained on the path toward the EU, Yanukovych's presidency had been described as a democratic backslide, with a marked increase in corruption and press censorship throughout his years in office. But if that wasn't enough, Yanukovych suddenly changed course in November 2013, when he accepted a trade agreement with Russia instead of signing an economic deal with the EU. The move to make Ukraine more reliant on Russia economically didn't go well with a large part of the Ukrainian people. The first revolt against the policies started nearly immediately, picking up speed and intensity. The protests reached their peak in February 2014, when nearly 100 protesters were killed. But the Ukrainian people managed to oust Yanukovych from office, and a new, unelected government was reformed on February 22, 2014. Putin decided to ensure that Ukraine was not a viable NATO member either. 5 days later, on February 27th, Russia invaded Crimea. Special forces without military markings seized control of local government offices in Sevastopol. Separatist movements sprung up in the Donbas region, funded and equipped, of course, by Russia. They refused to accept the new government. Just like in Georgia, the breakaway People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk were declared. The Ukrainian armed forces moved in and attacked them, beginning a brutal civil war that was still ongoing when Russia invaded in 2022. So it could be argued that the annexation of Crimea started the currently ongoing war in Ukraine. After the annexation, the West immediately introduced economic sanctions against Russia, which didn't do much, frankly. The Ukrainian military, however, started training with NATO manuals and tactics, and the country returned to a pro-European position. When the question of Ukraine becoming a NATO member was once again broached in the early 2020s, Russia responded with the Special Military Operation, to once again cut that off at the stem. But is there more to the "Ukrainians and Russians are the same people" rhetoric than meets the eye? In 2021, Putin made several claims in a lengthy essay titled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians" on the Kremlin's website. However, the University of Rochester has suggested that pretty much everything in the essay has been exaggerated to align with Putin's view of Russia being threatened by the West. Ukraine has existed, in one way or another, as an independent nation since the breakup of the Kievan Rus state, with a lengthy history whose cultural roots are blurred with Russia, but have also remained distinct. So if Ukrainians aren't quite the same as Russians, why is Putin trying so hard to bring Ukraine under his control? Beyond the claims of cultural unity, there is the aspect of Russia's stated security concerns. The Soviet Union had the third largest population in the world and was even bigger territorially than the Russian Federation is today. But by far and away, the country's major population centers within Russia itself were arguably its most vital assets. This includes the capital city of Moscow, but also other large cities such as St. Petersburg, Novosibirsk, and Yekaterinburg. The states in the Soviet Union that were west of the Russian core of large cities were essentially buffer zones with the West. The populated cities needed to be far away from any borders with other countries, as the Soviet Union feared they might get attacked at any point. To get an idea of how deep-seated this obsession is, we can take a look at the history between Finland and Russia. The city of St. Petersburg was initially located just a few miles from the border with Finland. During World War II, the Soviet Union went to war with Finland, who had sided with Nazi Germany, a conflict that lasted practically until the end of the wider war. The result of the Russo-Finnish conflict was that Finland lost more than a tenth of its territory, including one of its largest cities of Viborg. Most importantly, Finland ceded parts of the Karelia region, which is territorially closest to St. Petersburg. This gave the Soviet Union the much-needed buffer zone, which it immediately went to work to repopulate and militarize. Therefore, it could be argued that Putin wanted at least a portion of Ukraine's territory because it would give him a buffer zone against NATO, and that's exactly why he needed to stop Ukraine from joining the Western Alliance. He's been saying so himself for the last 15 years after all. But there's more to Ukraine's soil than just providing security for Russia. Ukraine holds one of the largest reserves of natural resources in the world, despite its relatively small land area. For example, the country is thought to contain coal deposits that are the 7th largest in the world and the 2nd largest in Europe behind Germany, at over 37 billion tons of coal reserves. This represents slightly more than 3% of the world's entire stockpile of coal. Even more importantly, more than 95% of those deposits are in the Donbas region, which Russia has occupied for the past 30 months, and in some parts already completely integrated into Russia. Historically, Ukraine was a significant producer of coal for the entire Soviet Union, and that prospect is something that Putin is surely looking toward if he manages to win the ongoing war. But there is yet another resource that might be even more important: natural gas. Ukraine doesn't have particularly noteworthy natural gas reserves, but its location makes it a lucrative natural gas exporter. The country has the 2nd largest natural gas reserve in Europe. With the EU cutting off its natural gas imports from Russia in favor of Norway and the US, Ukraine has become a potential target for expanding the natural gas industry. Furthermore, the untapped potential of natural gas in Ukraine could enable the country's economy to flourish post-war, which will boost its chances for both EU and NATO membership. Additionally, some reports suggest that the gas reserves in Ukraine could be as much as 4 times larger than the initial estimates indicated, with up to 5.4 trillion cubic meters of this precious resource. However, most of Ukraine's natural gas reserves are located east of the Dnipro River, primarily in the Donbas region and under the Black Sea. This puts the resource in practically the same position as the country's coal reserves. This precarious position is also potentially why China is advocating for Russia to keep the occupied territory under its control in a potential peace deal. The peace deal proposed by China and Brazil is one of the few options on the table, and one that Ukraine will likely not willingly accept. However, it paints a clear picture of just how deeply China's alliance with Russia goes. If Russia retains control over the occupied territory, it's estimated that it will gain as much as 80% of Ukraine's natural gas reserves, and that works for China. Metals are another vital resource exported by Ukraine, particularly iron, steel, manganese, nickel, and chromium. Exports of these 5 metals accounted for as much as 18% of Ukraine's total exports in the months before the invasion. The country produces roughly 70% more iron ore than Russia does, and is estimated to have the 5th largest iron ore reserve in the world, spread across more than 80 deposits. The iron ore reserves in Ukraine are actually only about a quarter of Russia's, indicating the country relies much more heavily on iron ore production. Additionally, Ukrainian industry is much more interconnected than Russia's, with significantly simpler logistics due to the country's comparatively small area. But why is that important? You see, Russia's primary exports for the past several decades have been oil and gas, which are directly causing climate change. Global shifts in the public perception of climate change and its effects have led to both EU and the UN setting optimistic goalposts for reducing coal, oil, and gas usage worldwide. To that end, Goldman Sachs forecasts that by 2030, 72% of new vehicle sales in the EU and 50% in the US will be electric vehicles. These electric vehicles need lithium batteries to operate and rare earth metals to power the industry. That's where Ukraine slots in. While neither Russia nor Ukraine has significant sources of lithium, Ukraine's metal industry is much more developed than Russia's. If the world moves away from importing Russian oil and gas, the country's economy could be in turmoil. It's estimated that oil and gas exports account for 45% of the government's total budget. It's fair to say that selling oil and gas is what has allowed Putin to fund the war, considering that a similar share of the budget is being spent on the military and national defense. Beyond the riches under its black soil, Ukraine is also a major exporter of corn, wheat, and other vital grains. In 2022, just before the invasion, the country was predicted to account for between 12% and 15% of global exports of these resources. Furthermore, with the country situated in the Northern Hemisphere, it syncs up with most major exporters in the Southern Hemisphere to provide a year-round supply of vital foodstuffs. The only major exporter in the same hemisphere as Ukraine is the US, which has a very different logistics network. When the war started, the reduction in Ukrainian grain exports caused global wheat prices to jump up by about 28%. Although prices began to decrease within a few months, they still remain 2 to 3% higher than before the invasion. The fact that Ukraine is exporting significant amounts of grain abroad gives it vital strategic importance. Russia is also a major supplier of grain to the world. If Putin manages to get a hold of the entire territory of Ukraine, Russia would be in a position to practically control the price of grain worldwide. This would give Russia unparalleled geopolitical influence. So gaining control of Ukraine's vital resources provides plenty of incentive for Putin to seize it. But beyond that, Putin has likely started the occupation for a more pressing reason: demographics. Shortly before the fall of the Soviet Union, the fertility rate in Russia, i.e. the number of children per woman, started declining sharply. In 1989, the fertility rate was around 2.01, which was mathematically the minimum rate required for the population to replace itself and eventually grow. However, the years following the fall of the Soviet Union saw the fertility rate plummet to as little as 1.4. Over the next 14 years, the birth rate fluctuated between 1.2 and 1.4. This meant that Russia kept losing more and more population to natural deaths and didn't have nearly as many births to replace them over the course of at least 14 years. The result of this sharp decline in the birth rate was Russia's population dropping from 144 million in 1991 to 137 million at the onset of the war. But the problem will likely propagate for generations, with estimates suggesting that Russia will lose another 15 million people by the mid-2040s. This is a direct result of the birth rate drop throughout the 90s and early 2000s. As fewer children were born during that time, modern Russia is now experiencing a significant deficit of young adults in their 20s and 30s. These missing people would have ideally been making their own families by now. As such, Russia's lack of new births is bound to become a cyclical problem. This will negatively impact on the country's economy. as it's practically impossible for the government to work around having far less people in the workforce paying taxes. The UN estimates that Russia's population could drop to between 74 and 112 million by the end of the century. And this estimate was made before the war in Ukraine, which has arguably taken its own toll on the country's demographics. When using the pre-war figure of roughly 137 million people, this means that Russia has the potential to lose nearly 40% of its current population in the next 75 years. Compare this to the UN's predictions for the rest of the world, which is around a 20% global population loss by the end of the century, and it's pretty clear that Russia is experiencing severe long-term population issues, driven partially by its economic downfall at the start of the 90s. Even more curiously, the declining birth rate in Russia was actually followed by stricter immigration policies. In the years immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union, people from former Soviet countries like Uzbekistan would immigrate to Russia for work, eventually becoming Russian citizens. However, a swathe of tougher immigration policies introduced at the turn of the century led to a drop in immigration. According to the Russian State Statistics Service, Goskomstat, legal immigration numbers peaked at nearly 1.15 million in 1994, then declined each year thereafter, shrinking to 351,000 in 2000 and only 70,000 in 2004. But how does that play into the invasion of Ukraine? Well, the answer's relatively simple. Ukraine has roughly a third of Russia's population, of which roughly 90% are Ukrainians and Russians. Perhaps even more importantly, Ukraine is tiny when compared to Russia. This is reflected in the country's relative population density, where Ukraine had a density of 70 people per square kilometer before the war started, while Russia had less than 9. With nearly 40 million people in a country that shares most of its culture with Russia, Putin likely believed that Ukrainians could become a major source of manpower, given the declining Russian demographics. Of course, this wouldn't be a foolproof solution. Ukraine experienced similar bouts of fertility rate drops in the 90s and 2000s. In fact, Ukraine was arguably even worse off, with the fertility rate dropping to around 1.1 in 2001. The figures bounced back sharply in the 2010s as Ukraine became increasingly pro-European and the economic situation in the country improved. But the net result is that even if Russia annexed the entirety of Ukraine, its population distribution would be strikingly similar to Russia's own demographics. This would likely not have solved the Russian demographics problem fully, but only delayed it for several years or, more optimistically, decades. Regardless, this was obviously a ready solution to Putin's problem. In the end, Putin's obsession with Ukraine is not about cultural values or uniting Russians and Ukrainians under a common banner. While that might be one of the justifications, Putin is much more concerned about the future of Russia, especially with regards to its security, cultural heritage, and unity. Ukraine is simply the most convenient target. With nearly 40 million people in the country, most of whom are culturally and ethnically similar to Russians, if not ethnically Russian themselves, Putin could practically grow Russia's population by a third by absorbing Ukraine into Russia. And if his original plan to dismantle the Ukrainian government had worked, that could have been achieved in mere weeks. Putin likely saw the writing on the wall that Russia's economy couldn't sustain itself through gas and oil indefinitely. This became especially true when the US significantly improved its production capabilities and secured the EU, Russia's previous biggest importer, as one of its main customers. Additionally, China's insistence on creating the Belt and Road Initiative to make gas and oil lines to the Middle East could make Russia's resources practically redundant. This meant that Putin had a small window of opportunity, with Ukraine still not in NATO and Russia's economy still growing. With Russia managing to shrug off the economic consequences of the pandemic better than many other nations, the invasion was likely an alignment of multiple factors coming together. But what do you think? Is there another reason Putin attacked Ukraine? Thank you for watching, and leave your comments below.